Hello, and welcome to the Nutrition Diva podcast, a show where I help you make sense of the latest nutrition news, headlines, and trends, and answer your questions about nutrition. I'm Monica Reinagel, and today's listener question is about vitamin D and sunscreen. My mother refuses to wear sunscreen, writes this listener, because she says they are all toxic and they prevent us from getting vitamin D. What is your stance on this? Given all the purported benefits of vitamin D, you might also have wondered how to balance your dermatologist's advice to wear sunscreen at all times with news reports about widespread vitamin D deficiency. So let's talk about how to thread that needle. It is true that sunscreen does inhibit the skin's ability to convert UV rays into vitamin D in the skin. However, it also blocks those same UV rays from damaging the collagen in our skin, which leads to wrinkles, and from harming our DNA, which increases our risk of skin cancer. So how do we strike this balance? Well, it doesn't have to be an either-or situation. We can be judicious about both our sun exposure and our sunscreen use to maximize vitamin D production while still protecting our skin. Before we get into the specifics of how to do that, let's take a step back and look at what vitamin D is and why it's so important. Vitamin D is unique in a couple of ways. First, it actually functions more like a hormone than a nutrient, regulating the secretion of other hormones, such as parathyroid hormone, and that's one that helps to control calcium levels in the blood. In fact, vitamin D is ultimately converted by the kidneys into a steroid hormone. Vitamin D is found naturally in a few foods, including cod liver oil, oily fish, liver, and egg yolks, and mushrooms. Mushrooms are actually the only plant-based foods that naturally contain vitamin D, and it's because mushrooms produce vitamin D when exposed to sunlight, similar to the way human skin does. In fact, here's a cool tip. You can increase the amount of vitamin D in your mushrooms by placing them in direct sunlight briefly. 15 to 30 minutes will do, and it won't work through a window. And you can maximize the vitamin D production by placing the mushrooms with the gills side up. Fortified foods, including milk and non-dairy milk alternatives, orange juice, and breakfast cereals are another way that people commonly get vitamin D from diet. But here's the other thing that makes vitamin D a little different than any other nutrient I can think of. And that is that food wasn't really meant to be our primary source of this nutrient. Sunlight was. Our skin produces this vitamin when it is exposed to UV rays. And this explains why people originating from different regions of the globe have varying skin colors. Those whose ancestors came from areas closer to the equator tend to have darker skin, which acts as a natural sunscreen against the stronger UV rays while still allowing for sufficient vitamin D production. Conversely, those from northern or southern regions have lighter skin to allow more UV penetration, and this ensures adequate vitamin D synthesis even with the weaker sunlight in those zones. Now, you might be wondering, if our bodies are so well adapted to produce vitamin D from sunlight, then why is vitamin D deficiency so widespread? And there are several factors that contribute to this. Number one, we spend a lot more time indoors, and that certainly limits our sun exposure. Number two, when we are outdoors, we often cover most of our skin with clothing. Number three, we use sunscreen, which, while protecting against sun damage, also blocks vitamin D production. And number four, many dark-skinned individuals now live very far from the equator, where they may not get enough UV exposure to produce sufficient vitamin D. As a result of all these factors, vitamin D deficiency has become increasingly common, particularly among children, the elderly, and those with darker skin. And research has now linked low vitamin D levels to a variety of health conditions, including heart disease, diabetes, depression, autoimmune diseases, osteoporosis, several types of cancer, and even obesity. Now, it's important to note that the relationship between vitamin D and these various conditions is not fully understood. In many cases, it's unclear whether low vitamin D levels cause or contribute to these health problems, or if the health problems might be leading to low vitamin D levels. Or perhaps whether our vitamin D levels might just serve as a proxy for other factors that influence our risk. For example, people with high vitamin D levels may have lower levels of depression, but that may primarily be due to the effect of sunlight on the amount of neurotransmitters produced in the brain and not the increased vitamin D production that sunlight might also provoke. So increasing vitamin D levels without that sun exposure would not be very likely to help in that scenario. And I think this is why the results from a wave of large research trials on vitamin D supplementation as a hedge against everything from osteoporosis to cancer to cardiovascular and autoimmune disease have been a little disappointing, yielding only modest benefits or inconclusive results. Apparently, vitamin D supplements are not the safe, cheap, and easy cure-all that many had hoped it might be. All the more reason to find a reasonable balance between enabling natural vitamin D production in the skin and protecting our skin from damage and aging. The amount of sunlight needed to produce adequate vitamin D levels varies greatly depending on factors such as the time of the year, your geographic location, your skin color, weather conditions, and the time of day. For example, here in Baltimore, on a cloudless July day at noon, I'd only need to spend 5 minutes out in the sun with my face, hands, and arms exposed to produce 25 micrograms, that's equivalent to 1,000 international units, of vitamin D. But if it were November, I'd need to stay out for about a half an hour. And if it were November and I were Black, it would take as much as an hour and a half. So to help determine your specific needs, you can use online calculators or smartphone apps that take these factors into account, and I will include links to some options in the show notes. These tools can help you balance skin protection and vitamin D production by estimating how much sun exposure might be beneficial before it makes sense to cover up. Of course, the best way to prevent skin aging and skin cancer when you're older is to be diligent about protecting your skin when you're young. Although those wrinkles or those basal cell carcinomas generally don't appear until the second half of life, most of the damage is actually done in the first half. The risk of vitamin D deficiency, on the other hand, is much higher when we're older. So it might make sense to back off the sunscreen a bit more as we age, especially if we live in areas or have lifestyles that don't provide a lot of exposure. The recommended dietary intakes for vitamin D actually assume that diet, as opposed to sun exposure, is going to be your primary source of vitamin D. And the current recommended daily intakes for vitamin D are 600 IU for adults up to the age of 70 and 800 IU for those over 70. And recent dietary survey data suggests that fewer than 5% of American and Canadian adults are actually ringing that bell. So if you're concerned about your vitamin D levels, you can ask your doctor for a blood test. And if your levels are low, your doctor might recommend some supplements. Now, as for sunscreen being toxic, it sounds as if this listener's mom came across some sources that blew the dangers way out of proportion, which often happens online. So here's the scoop. No toxic or other harmful effects have been observed in people applying sunscreen to their skin even after decades of use. Drinking it or injecting it into your body, on the other hand, definitely not recommended. Now, the harms to wildlife and aquatic ecosystems, such as coral reefs, are certainly more of a concern. And this can largely be minimized by opting for mineral-based sunscreens rather than chemical sunscreens. And you can also opt for SPF-rated clothing in lieu of sunscreen. So to wrap up today, while vitamin D may not be the cure-all that some have claimed, ensuring adequate levels is crucial for your overall health. Whether you choose to get your vitamin D from sunlight, food sources, supplements, or a combination of all three, it's important to find a balance that works for you. And remember, it doesn't have to be all or nothing when it comes to sunscreen use and vitamin D production. With a little knowledge and planning, you can protect your skin and maintain healthy vitamin D levels. That's it for this episode. If you have any questions or topics that you'd like me to cover in future episodes, you can email them to me at nutrition@quickanddirtytips.com. You can also leave me a voicemail at 443-961-6206. I'd also like to invite you to check out my other podcast. It's called The Change Academy, where we explore the art and science of creating positive behavior change, both in our own lives and in our workplaces and communities. You can find it on all the major podcast platforms. Just search for Change Academy. Nutrition Diva is a Quick and Dirty Tips podcast, and our team includes Brandon Getchis, Nathan Sems, Davina Tomlin, Holly Hutchings, and Morgan Christensen. Thanks so much for listening. I'll see you next week.